Now you clicked on this video because you want to learn about the top bass fishing lures for the month of June, and I'm going to share those with you. But there's a problem with these lures. What is that problem? My name's Tyler, and let's talk about it. Another giant, another giant. Look at that, y'all. I can't believe what I just caught. Yes! And that problem is geography. So over the last 5 years, I have fished every June in practically a different region of North America. Canada, New York, the Midwest, the Central, down in South Florida and Texas. And so I've noticed that this month, far above the others, has way more variety in terms of weather and climate. So if I was to recommend a singular list of lures, say a top 5, a top 6, for anglers who fish in upstate New York in June and South Texas in June, that list wouldn't help anybody. So I'm gonna recommend a list of lures in this video, some that are regional specific and some that apply to everybody across the country that fish in June right now, hopefully to help you guys catch more bass. So let's begin with lure number 1, and that is the Topwater Frog. The reason why I'm beginning this video talking about the Topwater Frog is because I truly believe this lure, the hollow belly frog, catches the most bass and the biggest bass for everybody across the country right now. I'm talking about Oregon, Washington, the whole Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, the New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania region, up into northern Michigan, South Florida, Texas. If you have healthy grass, I was wrong. Oh, that's the best kind of noise ever. Lily pads, hydrilla, milfoil, coontail, whatever you've got, there are bass at some point during the day. It could be all day if you're up north in the month of June, or it could be early in the morning if you are down in the hot south of the United States, even down in Mexico. There are times of the day that fish will be willing to eat a topwater frog. That's why I'm talking about it first. And one of the reasons why it applies to the entire country right now is because it imitates so many different types of forage the bass could be eating. So if you are down south, the fish are probably feeding on bluegill and baitfish. If you are in the center of the country, the bluegill spawn is going on right now. I'm talking about the bluegill beds. I'm talking about shad spawn still going on. And if you're up north, they are definitely feeding on bluegill up around the shallow grass. So either throw a white frog if they're feeding on baitfish, or throw some kind of perch colored. I know this one here is not, hopefully y'all can see that. This frog here is not actually perch colored, but I think it's a really good perch imitator. I will link this exact color down in the video description. It is my favorite topwater frog. Has a little bit of orange down there on the bottom, a red cup to the popping section of the frog. It is the popping pad perch. And like I said, I think this thing is just a bass catcher for everybody across the country. If you don't know how to throw a topwater frog and catch bass on it, where to throw it, how to throw it, the gear you need to effectively catch fish on a topwater hollow belly frog, I will leave my instructional, my masterclass video on this lure down in the video description. Over the last few weeks here in Texas, I have had a topwater frog tied on, and trust me, it will not be tied off. Untied. I will not take a topwater frog out of my arsenal for the entire summer, no matter where I travel. And the month of June is just the beginning of an awesome frog season. Now, moving on to lure number 2 that I'm recommending for the month of June, and this one is also not region specific. It applies to everybody, and that is the Wacky Rig. The Wacky Rigged worm is an amazing lure that catches bass, like I said, all around the country. But unlike the topwater hollow belly frog, it may take a little bit of some customization to fit everywhere in the country. But trust me, I don't care if you live in Alabama or Ohio right now, you can catch bass on a Wacky Rig. Let me tell you how. If you live anywhere in the southern United States, I'm talking about Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Florida. That's kind of what I call like the true southern of the United States. A Wacky Rig is going to be great right now, but maybe in a Nico rig form. So I got some flack in my Wacky Rig video for calling a Wacky and a Nico the same thing. I guess technically they're not. Maybe the way the hook goes into the worm changes, but to me, it is still a circle type hook in the middle of a stick bait. All you do is you change the hook placement or the hook direction, and you put a nail weight in the end. Still a Wacky Rig to me. But like I said, a Nico rig is going to be better in the south because the water is warming up. Those bass are moving from the bluegill bed areas out to deeper water. I'm talking about the drop-offs, the ledges, the brush piles, and a Nico rig, especially a weedless Wacky Nico rig, is going to be a perfect imitation to catch those bass that are again, they're hungry, but they're still kind of lethargic. Maybe they don't want a deep crankbait cranked over their heads, or they don't want to come up for a topwater out of a brush pile. And so a Wacky Rig is a fantastic lure for those of us in the South. Now, let's move on to talk about the middle of the U.S. How is a Wacky Rig effective for you guys? In this region of the country, your bluegill spawn is going on. And judging by the Major League Fishing tournament at Lake Guntersville a few weeks ago, the bluegill spawn is just bonkers right now. A lot of the guys in that tournament caught their fish on a Wacky Rig around shallow bluegill beds and shallow areas around docks, around grass. And so throwing a weightless wacky worm is a perfect way to catch bass who are feeding on bluegill around bed. And for you guys who live up north, I'm talking Ohio and above, your fish are maybe still a little bit pre-spawn, but most likely spawn to immediate post-spawn. And there is no better way to rig a Wacky Rig than on a weightless setup, just like the center of the United States, but you guys are focusing more on vertical targets and spawning bass. And like I said, I follow around the MLF pros. I stay with Alton Jones Jr. His first cast to every spawning fish, I would say without question, is a Wacky Rig. It is unassuming, and he says the biggest bass, if they will eat nothing else, if you throw the first cast in there with a Wacky Rig, oftentimes that can get you a one flipper on a bed. So the Wacky Rig is a great lure for the month of June. Now, the next three lures that I'm going to talk about in this tackle box are all region specific. So I'm not going to say you can't catch fish in a different region on this lure, but the lure that I'm going to recommend for this region is definitely the best one that I can think of right now in the month of June to catch bass. So make sure you're paying attention for the region that you live in or you are traveling to fish in. But before we talk about that, I've got to bring up an awesome fishing tool that I use to help me catch bass all around the country that can help you as well, and that is the Bass Forecast app. Bass Forecast is a mobile app that is built specifically around the life cycle and the patterns and behavior of a bass. No other fish, not trout, not saltwater. It is a bass app. By just putting in your location, it will spit out not just a list of recommended lures, a list of recommended locations, a list of recommended retrieve speeds, but also the current weather for your area and a rating from 1 to 10 on how your bass should be acting on today's fishing. And you can even toggle between the seasons. So if you find that the fish on your body of water, the pond you've gotten to in your geolocation, is not quite in the season the app recommended, maybe it's off by a few days, you can go back a season or forward a season and it will change the lure recommendations. And if you enjoy my videos, you're going to really enjoy Bass Forecast because my knowledge, my information is inside the app with detailed instructional videos on how to fish every single lure category that Bass Forecast recommends. So if it recommends a slow rolled spinnerbait, guess what? I've got a video in there showing you guys, shot in vertical form, how to fish a slow rolled spinnerbait. That is an incredible wealth of knowledge inside that app. If y'all want to download Bass Forecast, I will leave the link down in the video description. It is an awesome app, an awesome tool, but I say we talk about lure number 3 for the month of June, and that is for the southern region, and that is the giant soft plastic worm. Now, like I said, I'm recommending this lure here for mostly those of us who fish in the South. So those of us whose bass are totally done spawning. The bluegill spawn, as a matter of fact, is coming to an end, and therefore the shad spawn is definitely at an end as well. The entire spawning cycle is done. The bass have moved out deep. Now, I'm not saying you can't catch them up shallow. There's always resident bass who live up shallow, but most of the big ones especially are going to be in deeper water, the deeper sections of your pond, the deeper sections of your lake. And so a big worm, in my opinion, especially for the month of June, in Texas, in Alabama, and Mississippi, maybe some in Arkansas or Oklahoma, definitely in Florida, the big worm is going to be the best way for you to catch numbers of bass and the biggest bass of your year. And the two main ways that I throw this are a Texas rig with usually a 3/16 to a ½ ounce weight, and that is for grass and wood, or I throw a big worm, usually a big straight tail worm, an 8 to 11 inch straight tail worm on a big shaky head. Now, both of those presentations are both weedless. I have found the Texas rig to be a little bit more weedless, which is why I recommend it for grass fishing, but really you can't go wrong with either. Now, where specifically should you target with the giant worm? Well, if your lake has grass as the main structure, the main cover, target the edges of the grass, the big deep holes in the grass, but especially the deepest grass you can find. Maybe a deep hump in the lake that has grass growing on it is a great place to throw the big worm. And if you're in a pond and you want to catch the biggest bass in that pond right now, you want to find the deepest section of that pond that has good, healthy aquatic vegetation and throw yourself a big worm. Trust me, it catches big ones. Now, what about lakes and ponds that have rock or gravel or hard bottom as the main structure? You don't really have wood or grass. It's just kind of, drop-offs, rock piles, ledges. Well, that's exactly where you want to focus on the big worm. I'm talking about, you know, if you're in the Tennessee River area, the Tennessee Valley, maybe throw it on those ledges. If you're in Texas, maybe focus on the drop-offs, the steep breaks, close to, if not in, the creek channel. That's where to focus on throwing the big worm. And then if your body of water has hard bottom and you have some wood as your prime offshore structure, definitely throw the big worm around the biggest, thickest trees you can. I'm not talking about just the most branches that are in the water. I'm also talking about the thickest root system. So the deepest cypress trees, the deepest cedar trees, as well as, of course, man-made brush piles in lakes like Toledo Bend, Sam Rayburn, any lake around the Dallas-Fort Worth area, as well as in Florida. I know some of y'all's lakes in Florida have brush piles. Probably not supposed to, but they do. Throw a big worm around those. And if you follow these tips with the big worm, trust me, you're gonna catch some of the biggest bass of your year. They are hungry right now, and a big worm is a great way to catch them. Now, moving on to lure number 4 for the center of the country, the center region, I'm gonna talk about my favorite for fishing around bluegill beds, skipping around docks, and that is the soft plastic jerkbait. The soft plastic jerkbait is a fantastic bluegill imitator. Now, of course, you can throw the shad colors, the whites, the grays, the glimmers, but I think during this time of the year, the month of June, the shad spawn is coming to a close pretty much everywhere, and so the bluegill spawn is really what you're focusing on. Now, I know I already talked about the Wacky Rig being a great way to catch bluegill spawning bass, and I guess I should probably kind of backtrack here for a second. For those of y'all who never fished around the bluegill spawn, when the bluegills all spawn, they spawn in a group. They all spawn together. They make these big craters, these big white areas, and it's basically like a dinner table for the bass. Honestly, the bass are kind of like menaces. They're kind of bullies during this time period where they just cruise around the bluegill beds. The bluegills are spawning, of course, so they can't leave, and they need to defend their nests, and so bass will get hungry. They'll eat a bluegill, and then they'll keep swimming around. So if you're not throwing a Wacky Rig, the best option, in my opinion, is the soft plastic jerkbait. Now, the soft plastic jerkbait can also be fished a little bit deeper with a belly-weighted hook. So if you have deeper bluegill beds, or your bluegills are totally done spawning and both have moved off to the edges in the center of the country, a soft plastic jerkbait is a fantastic choice for that. You can also throw a donkey rig. You can throw 2 on 1 baitcaster, but finding success on the soft plastic jerkbait, especially in watermelon red flake, is hard to not do. It's easy to catch fish this time of the year in the center of the country on this thing. As a matter of fact, it is my favorite pond lure for every pond at practically all times of the year across the country. So if you're not throwing this thing, go to the link in the video description, pick yourself up a pack of 4-inch caffeine shads and a 4-aught or 3-aught wide gap hook, and go to town catching bass. If you're taking somebody bass fishing for the first time this June and they have never caught a bass in their life, the soft plastic jerkbait, really regardless of region, is a great lure to give them. And the last lure that I'm going to recommend, especially for y'all who fish up north, I'm talking about Ohio, Pacific Northwest, your Dakotas, your New York, is going to be the small swim bait on a jig head. In this region of the country, the smallmouth bass really start to come into play. Matter of fact, the biggest smallmouth on the planet are in this region. You know, this lure even applies to you guys who live up in Canada as well. You apply to the northern region. And a lot of lures can work in this region to catch smallmouth and largemouth bass. A drop shot, a Ned rig, like I mentioned, a Wacky Rig. But I think if I'm gonna recommend one lure that catches the bass basically in all seasons of their spawn, the pre, the spawn, and the post spawn, especially smallmouth, it's going to be a small swim bait on a jig head. Maybe 1.75, 225. I wouldn't say any bigger than like 3 1/4 in terms of the swim bait size. Here I'm throwing the Strike King Rage Swimmer. Really any small ribbed or non-ribbed swim bait works. And my favorite swim bait head is the Outcast Tackle Golden Eye. I feel like it has a really good small presence in the water, pushes almost no water, and has a good quality hook, and of course, that golden eye. I don't care if the bass in your body of water are feeding on perch, on bluegill, on smelt, on minnows, a small swim bait. Cast as far as you can, counting it down as it sinks in the water column, and then slowly swimming it back is a great way to trigger all kinds of bass up north throughout the month of June. And if you lack confidence in any of these lures that I've talked about today, I will leave my masterclass instructional links down in the video description, teaching you guys how to rig, where to throw, and of course, how to catch fish on every single one of these lures. Now, one more thing to consider about the Topwater Frog is that it may not actually be the best choice for your location. If you're not fishing around shallow cover, a treble hooked topwater is going to be better in terms of getting bites and keeping them hooked up. So I made a video that I will link in this corner talking about the differences and similarities between the topwater popping frog and the topwater hard popper, because picking the right one can lead to more bass. So like I said, that video is linked up here in the corner. I would really appreciate it if y'all would go watch that video. My name's Tyler, and we'll see you guys next time on the channel.